Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second tutorial of the database course. I want to start with a recap on what we have done in the last tutorial. What did we see? We saw the ERD, which is the entity relationship diagram. What was the ERD in short? The ERD was actually a picture of the data. If you remember, we have been given a problem, a set of wordings, a very whole big set of words, and we transformed it into a picture in order for us as software engineers to understand what is meant by everything and what should be drawn or what should be taken care of in the design of our database. We have seen what an entity is, which was an object. It was like the object of the of CS4. So we get the abstract objects out of the problem and we define them as entities drawn in a rectangle. Next, we had the attributes, which were the instance variables that each entity has. So if we have, for example, the entity student, we would have attributes like the instance variables in CS4, which describe every entity and all the attributes for each entity. One or several attributes must uniquely identify the entity. As we have said, every entity should at least have one primary key that denotes it. And the primary key is one chosen candidate key. And the candidate key is a super key, which is anything that uniquely identifies the entity or that uniquely identifies any instance of the entity. And it has another additional property, which is that no proper subset of it is another super key. Okay, this is the candidate key, and a super key is any set of attributes that uniquely identify an entity. We have said that we have multiple attribute types. The first type that we have seen is the multi-valued attribute, which describes if an attribute may have several values, not only exactly one value. Like, for example, the telephone number. We have seen the composite attributes, which are the attributes that consist of different parts, like, for example, the address, and we have seen the derived attributes, which were like the experience years calculated for the pilot example in the previous tutorial, which is any attribute that can be calculated from other attributes. So, for example, if we have the start date of the pilot and we have the current year, we can subtract the current year minus the start date, so we will get the difference, which actually is which actually demonstrates the experience years of this pilot. We have also seen that the different entities have relationships that connect them or that link different entities to one another, which usually constitute of verbs. There is only one additional thing that we want to add to the normal ERD that we have seen, which is what we call a weak entity. A weak entity is, at the end of the day, an entity. It is like the normal entities. However, it has one extra criterion, which is that its attributes, so the attributes that are connected or that directly belong to this entity, do not or are not complete to uniquely identify it. So we always have an attribute or a set of attributes that uniquely identifies our entity. If the attributes there are not sufficient, so we need an extra attribute to uniquely identify this entity. So this entity on its own cannot be uniquely identified. We call this entity a weak entity, and we draw it like double squares. So the symbol, in order to see that this is a weak entity, we draw double squares, one inside the other. Okay? And how are we going at the end of the day to uniquely identify it? We are going to make use of a stronger entity. So I need to have a stronger entity, a normal entity that can be uniquely identified on its own, and there should be a relationship that connects them together, so that the weak entity would inherit or would make use of this strong entity in order for it to be uniquely identified. So it will be uniquely identified with the attributes of the stronger entities. This relationship is a specific type relationship. This is called the identifying relationship. This relationship is the one that identifies or that uniquely identifies each instance of this entity. And we draw it like double rhombus. Two rhombuses inside one another. What does this relationship denote? It denotes that this weak entity is going to inherit the primary key of the stronger entity. It's going to make use of it. Even if there is part of the primary key in the weak entity, however, it's not enough alone to uniquely identify the weak entity. With this partial primary key together with the strong primary key, together they will form the primary key of this weak entity. Hence, whenever we have any weak entity, we need to have an identifying relationship with one strong entity from which it will inherit the primary key. Let us solve one exercise in order just to practice. As we have seen in the last tutorial, we need to read the problem thoroughly and then start identifying our entities along with their attributes and the relationship that connects the different entities with one another. We have a company database that needs to store the information about its employees. The following information has been collected. Every employee has an SSN, salary, and phone number or phone numbers. Every department has a department number, name, and budget. If an employee has a child or more, his or her name and age should be recorded. Each employee works in exactly one department. Each department is managed by exactly one employee. A child must be identified uniquely by name when the parent employee is known. Assume that only one parent works for the company. We do not need to keep track of information about a child if his or her parents leave the company. Okay, now we want to read it once again. We want to get all the entities that we have. Okay, a company database needs to store information about its employees. The following information has been collected. Every employee has an SSN, salary, and phone number. So employee in this case is what? It is an entity. What are its attributes? SSN, salary, and phone number. And be careful that we have S between brackets, which means that this is a multi-valued attribute. Every department, so department here is another entity, has a department number, name, and budget. If an employee has a child, his or her name should be recorded. So child is an entity, and his name and age should be recorded. Each employee works in exactly one department, so we have works, which is a relationship that connects an employee with one department. And we have that each department is managed, so we have also another relationship managing between department and employee. And then a child must be identified uniquely by name when the parent employee is known. So the name on its own is not enough to uniquely identify this child. It also needs the parent in order for it to be uniquely identified. Hence, the child here is what? Is a weak entity. It's not a normal entity. They make use of the name and the SSN of the parent. Hence, here there is indeed a relationship, an identifying relationship with child together with his parent. We do not need to keep track of information about a child if his or her parents leave the company. Hence, it's always correlated, or as a consequence of the child not being uniquely identified on its own, it actually depends on the parent. It is a consequence of not being able to identify this entity on its own. Hence, this is a consequence of it. Now, let's recap. We have an employee as an entity, a department as an entity, child with name and age, and works, which is a relationship between employee and department, and manages, which is another different relationship between department and employee. And we have a relationship that connects the employee with the child. Now, let us start drawing the ERD. Now, let us start drawing the ERD type. The first entity that we had was employee. So we had the employee as a standalone entity. What attributes does it have? It has the SSN, the salary, and the phone number. The phone number was not normal entity, it was not an normal attribute. It was what type of attribute? It was the multi-valued attribute علشان, if you remember, we had S between brackets, which means that this can have more than one value. طيب what is the SSN? The SSN is the social security number. It is like الرقم القومي عندنا اللي هو بيكون موجود جوه البطاقة. This is a unique value for every and each person living in one country. So this cannot be repeated for any two persons. Hence we can use this as the primary key طبعا علشان we are sure that this is not repeated for any two employees. Okay? طيب the other entity was department. This was an entity. What attributes does the department have? It has department number, عندها budget and name. طيب in general we enumerate the different departments in order for it to be uniquely identified. يعني that's why a department number is there. Hence a department number can be used as the primary key because this is the purpose of a department number إن هي خليها تبقى uniquely identified among other departments. Hence we can use the department number as the primary key. Okay? The last entity that we had was child. Was child a normal entity? No, it was not. What was it? It was a weak entity. Why is it a weak entity? Because, as it was said in the question, a child must be identified uniquely by name when the parent employee is known. So it inherits or it makes use of the parent entity, of the parent employee entity اللي هو ال SSN بتاع ال parent ده عشان يبقى uniquely identified. Hence, this is the identifying relationship. يعني عندنا identifying relationship كده اسمها has that connects the employee with his children. عشان كده يبقى الchild يبقى ايه uniquely identified. طب let's read the sentence one more time. A child must be identified uniquely by name. By name. So it has the name as the attribute and this name is part of the key. It's partly used for the child to be uniquely identified. So it does not only make use of the SSN, however the SSN plus the name. And I will show you how. هو الchild كان عنده كمان an age as an attribute. I will show you how. If we have for example SSN value 1 and this one has the child Omar. Okay? The meaning of the child being a weak entity and it inherits or the identifying relationship is with the employee, it means that this value cannot be repeated. يعني I cannot see one more time one with عمر. ممكن الاقي one تاني the same employee has the child سلمى. Okay? وممكن الاقي اسمه عمر تاني as a child however with another employee. This means in this employee is different than this employee عشان ال SSN مختلف واحنا قلنا ال SSN is unique. فمعنى ان انا عندي 1 وعمر و2 وعمر معناها ان في employee ال SSN بتاعه is 1 has the child عمر وفي employee تاني another employee has the SSN 2 and their name is also عمر. Okay, but this is not a problem. However, the problem is to have the same employee with the same child name repeated twice. This is not allowed. Okay, ده معنى ال weak entity. However, the name can be repeated on its own and the SSN can be repeated on its own but with different combinations. Okay, now for the relationships, we had two relationships connecting employee department, one for works in and one for manages. Okay, so these are all the relationships that we have. طيب, let's do the cardinality and the participation. If we have one employee, one single employee, how many children at maximum can it have? We always have يعني we always do the cardinality as follows. بنثبت واحدة من الانتيتي دي and we ask ourselves how many is it related to the other entities. لو عندنا employee واحد at maximum هيبقى عنده how many children? Many. So we put the many side the many symbol here. طب at minimum يعني are we allowed to have employees that have 0 children or at minimum is it 1? لا عادي ممكن يكون عندي employees that do not have any children فنحط هنا 0. طيب let's do it the other way around. لو عندنا child واحد to how many parents do they belong? in the weak entity, in this case, this is a weak entity that is always connected with exactly one parent. يبقى هيبقى عنده at minimum كام parent و at maximum كام parent؟ only and only one. Because if the child is there, then it should be the case that they have a parent in the company. احنا مش هنkeep track of children that their parents have left. عشان كده هي weak. فده معناه ايه؟ ده معناه لو البارنت مشي كل الchildren بتاعه اللي جوه الداتابيز هيتمسحوا من عندنا، مش هيكونوا موجودين عندنا في الداتابيز. This is a very important point, that the weak entity is always related with exactly one parent, one and only one parent. Okay? طيب works in the one employee works in how many departments? In general, they work at maximum in one department and at minimum in one department. يعني كل employee is under the umbrella of exactly one department. مفيش employee مش بيشتغل في ولا department ومفيش employee بيشتغل في more than one department. Okay? طب الديبارتمنت الواحدة one department is related to how many employees or is work in it how many employees? In general, there are many employees that work in one department. فالديبارتمنت الواحده ممكن يبقى فيها employees كتير. طب ينفع يكون فيها zero employees؟ we can allow for zero employees if this is a new department that did not have any assigned employees yet. Okay? طيب the department بقى, the one department is managed by how many employees? In general, every department has exactly one manager. يعني مفيش department ما عندهاش ولا manager. Every department has at least one manager. طيب الemployee ممكن يمانج how many departments? In general, they manage at maximum one department. يعني لو هو manager هيمانج one department. طب لو هو مش manager, لو هو أي employee تاني هيمانج zero departments. So if we take any employee and ask ourselves how many departments do they manage at maximum? هيبقى 1 لو هو manager. طب لو هو مش بيمانج هتبقى 0. So it's 1 or 0. So this is the ERD of this exercise, having the weak entity of the child. What you have seen in the lecture is that we have extended the ERD. يعني ما استكفيناش بال ERD, we had added more things for it to be more expressive. يعني احنا عايزين نحط حاجات زياده عشان نخلي ال ERD بتاعتنا more expressive. فعملوا لها extension وبقت اسمها EERD, Extended Entity Relationship Diagram, which extends the normal ERD to include various types of abstraction and to express constraints more clearly. So at the end of the day, we want it to be more expressive for us to understand. So they added the idea of super and subclasses اللي هو single inheritance. يعني يبقى عندي an entity زي دي تبقى super class, ويبقى عندي different and other entities that are subclasses. طيب لو نفتكر كده من جافا, what was the idea of a superclass and a subclass? الidea بتاعت subclasses و superclasses is the following. For us to avoid repetitions. يعني احنا لو عارفين ان في حاجه بتتعاد more than once, why to repeat it in different classes؟ لان نعمل super class ونخلي sub classes بتinherit منه حاجته بس عشان avoid repetitions. This is exactly the idea of this inheritance. What does it do? Subclasses inherit ايه بقى in our case? Inherit the attributes and the relationships. So what does a subclass inherit from its superclass? It inherits the entities. يعني لو هو هنا عنده أي entity for example X, ولو عنده أي relationship, ال attributes اللي هما دول ال subclasses دول do inherit the attributes plus the relationships. يعني كأن secretary has all the attributes of an employee plus all the relationships that an employee have. The finance also has the same idea. Okay? This idea, the super and subclasses idea is to express that some classes inherit the attributes of a superclass. طيب عندنا كذا حاجة that we need to take care of while drawing super and subclasses. طيب أول حاجة the following. We always have a circle in the middle and all subclasses are connected to this circle. And the superclass is connected with exactly one line from upwards. يعني ال upward line ده بيقولوا ان ده superclass ودول subclasses. طب علشان ما نتلخبطش, what should we do? We will draw this cup. This cup, what does it denote? هي بتبقى دايما opened towards the superclass. يعني بتبقى مفتوحة كده ناحية ال superclass. So we can easily see which of the entities is constitutes the superclass and which of them constitute the subclasses. So in this case, we have a superclass and different subclasses, as we can see from the cup, that this is that the upwards اللي هو employee is the superclass and the secretary and the finance are the subclasses. Okay, this is the first thing that you need to know. طيب, what does this circle denote? We always ask ourselves one question. After drawing this, we always ask ourselves one question. Can it be the case that the subclasses be disjoint ولا overlapping؟ يعني هل ينفع secretary تبقى also a finance؟ يعني ينفع حد يبقى common ما بين الاثنين؟ ولا دايما السكرتاريز لوحدهم والفاينانس لوحدهم؟ This is the question that we need to ask ourselves. If they can overlap، يعني ينفع يكون في secretary and finance together they are the same instance، يعني هو كأني بعمل object واحد والobject واحد ده is the same secretary and finance at the same time. We say that these classes are overlapping and we write in this circle the O letter. طيب what if they must be disjoint؟ يعني كل واحد فيهم ما ينفعش يبقى common ما بين الاثنين. What are we going to state in this circle? D. We are going to write the D letter. So they are either disjoint or overlapping. It's always the case. You need to ask yourself this question and answer it. And depending on your answer, you will write either D or O. طيب, the most important thing out of this super subclasses, they must satisfy what we call the is-a relationship. يعني I can always say that an employee is a secretary. يعني ال is-a relationship جاية من ناحية السوبر كلاس لكل سب كلاس عنده. فدايما لازم نقدر نستيت this statement ان الامبلوي is a secretary والامبلوي is a finance and the employee is whatever subclass it has. لازم ال is a relationship تكون بتهولد. ما ينفعش يبقى عندي for example a subclass that whenever I say that the employee is this subclass I will get a wrong semantic. I will get something that is not correct. This should not happen at all. ال is a relationship دي لازم دايما to hold for any instance. So this is it. Now what is left is the completeness. برضو when talking about super and subclasses there is what we call completeness. يعني ايه بقى completeness؟ احنا قلنا disjoint و overlapping معناهم ايه؟ طب let us كده understand quickly what these two EERDs denote. عندنا هنا student that is an entity and it has its subclasses undergrad and postgrad. This example you should have seen in the lecture. طيب, عرفت منين ان دول subclasses وان ده super class؟ عشان في cup بص لفوق وهنا في arrow بيحدد لي مين السب كلاسز ومين السوبر كلاس. طيب بعد كده عندي هنا another EERD، عندي person، عندي club member وعندي student and these are the subclasses و this is the super class as we have seen من الكب. طيب يعني ايه disjoint هنا؟ معناها ان ما ينفعش undergrad يبقى postgrad at the same time وما ينفعش postgrad يبقى undergrad at the same time. طيب يعني ايه overlapping؟ يعني لو عندي person they can be a student and a club member at the same time or they can be a club member and a student at the same time. يعني ال instances from the subclasses can be overlapping. عشان كده هنا في O وهنا في D. Okay? طيب, there is a further question that you need to ask yourself whenever you draw a super subclass relationship. هل all the students in this case are either undergrads or postgrads ولا في other types that I do not still know about أو I'm not keeping track in my database؟ يعني ممكن for example يبقى في بالنسبة لي student شكل آخر. لو ما فيش if this is not the case معناه إن هي complete، معناه إن all my subclasses are complete. Hence I will draw two lines here from the superclass to this circle, the circle of the disjointness. وده معناه بيقول لي ايه two lines دول؟ ان all the students are either because of the D, the disjoint, are either one of those two types, either undergrads أو postgrads. طيب on the other hand بقى لما أنا عندي هنا person عنده only one line، ده معناه إيه اللاين الواحد ده؟ ده معناه إن subclasses are not complete. ده معناه إن في persons that are neither club members nor students. يعني for example ممكن يكون عندي واحد that is an employee بيشتغل however they are not a student nor a club member. يبقى كده معناه ان السب classes بتاعتي are not what we say complete. Hence we leave it as one line. وهنا هيبقوا two lines. So in summary again, we have, whenever we have super and subclasses, we need to ask ourselves two questions. The first question, هل subclasses disjoint or overlapping؟ لو هما disjoint يعني subclasses ينفع يبقى حد common ما بينهم هما الاتنين، يبقى we will write the letter D in the circle of the disjointness. If the other way around, then we will write O. طيب, the other question, هل every instance of a superclass belongs to one or more of the subclasses or not? If it is a yes, then we need two lines. If it is a no, then we will leave it as one line from the superclass to the circle of disjointness. So these are the most two important questions that you need to ask yourself whenever you are talking about super subclasses. We have also another type of inheritance, which is in this case multiple inheritance. Multiple inheritance is having one subclass that inherits from more than one superclass. This is unlike Java. In Java, multiple inheritance is not allowed. We only have single inheritance in Java. So هنا احنا allow in a single subclass, like for example هنا a person, to inherit from more than one superclass. How did I get to know that this is the subclass and the club member along with the student هما superclass؟ لأني لقيت الcup دي مفتوحة لفوق، مفتوحة ناحية الclub member and the student. So the openness towards club member and student makes it, or it gives us the intuition that this person inherits from club member and student. Okay, so person here is the subclass where club member and student are the superclasses. طيب. Now we have the circle, the same circle as the one in the multiple in the single inheritance. هنا في multiple inheritance بنسأل نفسنا سؤال تاني. هل السبكلاس ده inherit from all the superclasses at the same time ولا from either one of them at a time؟ يعني ينفع البيرسون ده inherit من club member و student at the same time ولا inherit from only one of them at a time؟ لو هيقدر inherit من الاتنين we will leave it empty. It will be left as having nothing inside it. طب what if we have the example of, for example, the owner the subclass and it has the bank and the organization as the superclasses؟ ده معناه ايه؟ ان الowner زي في الاكزامبل بتاع lecture هو هيبقى either bank or organization. مش هينفع يبقى الاتنين at the same time. It will only inherit from one of the superclasses at a time. In this case احنا مش هنسيبها فاضية، هنحط حرف اليو inside it. هيبقى جواها يو، فهتبقى هتبقى اسمها union. هيبقى يا اما بينهرت من ده or من ده، هينهرت from only one at a time. So this is the first question that we need to ask ourselves. هل السبكلاس ده بينهرت from all of them at a time؟ If this is the case we will leave it empty. Or does it inherit from only one of them at a time? If this is the case, then we will put a U inside this circle. Okay. The second question that we need to ask ourselves, هل في completeness ولا لأ؟ The same idea as in the multiple as in the single inheritance. In the multiple inheritance as the single inheritance. هنسأل نفسنا هل كل club members وكل students، هل كل حاجة في السوبر كلاسز بتاعتنا belong to these subclasses ولا في حاجات في السوبر classes that are not still completed؟ يعني ممكن يكون في club member that is not a person, for example that is an animal. يعني الانيمالز ينفع مثلا for example يبقى عندهم membership في club. يعني في ناس تانيين غير البيرسون ينفع يبقوا club members، او في ناس تانيين غير البيرسون ينفع يبقوا students. لو this is not the case، يعني في club members that are not persons او students that are not persons، يبقى هنleave it as one line here from the person to the circle. يعني هنا الكومبليتنس بقى بتتحط ناحية السب كلاس مش ناحية السوبر كلاس. بنسأل نفسنا هل كل السوبر كلاسز دول التايبس بتاعتهم كلها هم البيرسون ده ولا في حاجات تانية؟ لو هم كلهم are the same or are completely belonging to this person هنحط two lines. يعني لو club members و students are only persons, there are not any other type, which makes sense in this example, then we will put two lines from the person to the circle of to this small circle between the superclasses and the subclasses. So to repeat or to summarize, we have two questions to ask ourselves. هل السبكلاس يقدر ينهرت من كله at the same time ولا لازم ينهرت من واحد at the time? In this way we decide if it's a U or we will leave it empty. طيب, the second question that we need to ask ourselves, هل كل حاجة في السوبر classes are completely belonging to this subclass ولا في حاجات تانية belong to other things other than this subclass? لو this is the case, then we will leave it one line if they are not complete, and we will put two lines if all the superclasses do belong to this person. And this is it with all the new information that you need to know about the EERD. Let's start solving the exercise. Let us start by solving this exercise. Now, this is also a big exercise. However, the idea out of it is to understand the EERD correctly. Now, let us start reading. Draw an EERD, or the extended entity relationship diagram, for the following problem. Show all entities, relationships, cardinalities, and optionalities. Optionalities here is like the participation. You may use any additional entities. The Cairo Museum needs your help in designing a new database system. The museum has a collection of art objects, each of which has a unique ID number, an artist, if known, a creation year, a title, and a description. Art objects are categorized as either permanent or borrowed. Permanent objects are those owned by the museum, whereas borrowed are those temporarily provided by other collections. For permanent objects, we should keep track of the date of the date the object was acquired, its status, whether on display, on load or stored, and price. For borrowed art objects, we need to keep track of the collection from which they were borrowed, the date borrowed, and the date that they should be returned. The art objects are also categorized into painting, sculpture, and other. A painting has a type, material, and style. A sculpture has a material from which it was created, height, and weight. For all art objects, data regarding the country of origin and epoch should be kept track of. The museum should also keep track of artist information when available, such as the name, date of birth, date of death, and main style. A collection represents an organization from which the museum might borrow art objects. For each collection, the following data should be kept track of: name, museum, address, and telephone number. Periodically, different exhibitions take place, where many art objects are displayed. Each exhibition has a theme, name, and start date and end date. Okay. Let us read it again and try to get out the entities that we have. We want to draw an EERD. We want to show all entities, relationships, cardinalities. You may use additional entities. The Cairo Museum needs your help in designing a new database system. Up until here, we don't have any entity. The museum has a collection of art objects, each of which has a unique ID. So the art objects in this case is what? Is my first entity, each of which has a unique ID. So the unique ID is what? Is the first attribute of the art object, and it is unique, so it is my primary key. An artist, we may say that this is an attribute, a creation year, a title, a description. Art objects are also categorized as either permanent or borrowed. Permanent objects are owned by the museum, whereas borrowed are those temporarily provided by other collections. طيب, up until here, did I get to know لو permanent و borrowed دول مثلا attribute زيادة جوه الart object ولا هم entities ولا ايه؟ هنحاول نعرف من الباقي. For permanent objects, we should keep track of the date of the object was acquired, its status. يبقى ده معناه ايه؟ لو انا عندي حاجات that I will need to keep track about this element، يبقى ده اكيد عبارة عن entity. And this date that the object was acquired is one attribute of this entity. والstatus بتاعته is another attribute. طيب, borrowed objects is another entity we should keep track of the collection from which they were borrowed. يعني مثلا ال collection دي احتمال تبقى attribute the date borrowed and the date of the returning. The art objects are also categorized into painting and sculpture and other. A painting has a type, material and style. يبقى painting ده ايه؟ entity وعنده type وماتيريال وستايل. وsculpture ده عبارة عن ايه؟ برضو another entity which has a material from which it was created, a height and weight. طيب البيرمننت والبورود عبارة عن ايه؟ هم عبارة عن art objects، يعني في الآخر هم الاتنين دول عبارة عن art objects. طب والبينتنج والسكالبتشر والاذر دول عبارة عن ايه؟ عبارة برضو عن art objects. طب هل هم permanent art objects ولا borrowed؟ هم ينفع يكونوا الاتنين. They can be both. لأن at the end of the day a painting or a sculpture or any other type of art object may be borrowed or permanent. طب let's see how are we going to make use of these facts. For all art objects data regarding the country of origin, يبقى the country of origin here is an attribute of art object. Epoch should be kept track of. يعني all of these we should keep track of them. The museum should also keep track of artist information when available. يبقى أنا عندي artist ايه data that I need to know about name, date of birth, date of death if applicable, and main style. Okay. A collection represents an organization from which the museum might borrow art objects. For each collection, the following data should be kept track of. يعني collection دي عبارة عن ايه؟ What does this say؟ إن ال collection دي عبارة عن ايه؟ Entity. وايه data that I need to keep track of؟ النame, الtype, الaddress, and phone. Periodically, different exhibitions take place where many art objects are displayed. Each exhibition has a theme and name, start date و end date. يبقى exhibition دي عبارة عن entity وعندها theme ونame وstart date and exhibition. اوكي. في some things that we need to revise. طيب احنا كنا قلنا في الأول إن artist هنا is an attribute of the art object. However, as we have seen in the exercise, artist is actually not an attribute. It is actually a what? It's an entity. لأن احنا in the middle of the exercise we have seen that the museum should also keep track of artist information. ومديني شوية حاجات that I need to keep track of. يبقى artist ده عبارة عن ايه؟ It's not an attribute. It is an entity وفي relationship ما بين الart object والartist. في relationship مثلا created. إن الارتست ده created this art object. So this is not an attribute. طيب عندنا ايه كمان؟ عندنا collection هنا لما قلنا borrowed art objects are borrowed from a collection. طيب we have seen برضو when we have gone in the exercise in the collection it's actually a what? It's actually an entity. So collection is not an attribute, it's actually an entity. وفي relationship بتجمعها ما بينها وما بين ال borrowed art objects. يعني هي borrow these art objects. طيب now we have all the entities, we have several relationships. الحاجة اللي عندنا بقى ان احنا عندنا art object. Let's think كده يعني let's take this as a scratch thinking. لو احنا عندنا هنا art object اوكي we have permanent و borrowed art objects. طيب let's think of ان احنا هنعمل دول sub classes وده super class بتاعهم. عندي permanent و borrowed دول sub classes لل art object. طب انا عندي painting وعندي sculpture. دول برضو two different entities that are art objects وهم برضو permanent. احتمال يبقوا permanent واحتمال يبقوا borrowed. ما احنا مش ما هو في paintings ممكن تبقى permanent في paintings ممكن تبقى borrowed في sculptures that are permanent في sculptures that are borrowed. طب انا عايزاهم برضو يبقوا art objects وعايزاهم يبقوا تحت permanent و borrowed. طب how can I draw something like that؟ اعمل ايه؟ the simple answer is ان انا اخلي دول sub classes وكل واحد من السب كلاسز دول عندهم two parents. يعني البينتنج البيرمننت والبارود in this case هيبقوا super classes للبينتنج وسكالبتشر. وبينتنج وبيرمننت وبارود دول هم sub classes لارت اوبجكت. فat the end of the day this painting و this sculpture inherit its attributes من مين؟ مش بس من البيرمننت والبارود but also from the art object. يعني انا كده عندي multiple inheritance و multiple levels of inheritance. يعني عندي دول بينهرتوا من دول ودول بينهرتوا من دول. ف at the end of the day الحاجة اللي تحت من الحاجة اللي فوق. طيب let's start drawing this EERZ in detail. Okay, what do we have? We had the art object ID, and the ID was unique, so it is the primary key of the art object. عندنا ال description of the art object. عندنا city of origin. وبعد كده عندنا ال creation year. وعندنا ال epoch. وعندنا ال title. And we had permanent art objects. وعندنا borrowed art objects. So ال permanent, what attributes does it have? It has the price. It has the acquiring date. And it has the status. طب و borrowed كان عندها ايه؟ كان عندها borrow date وعندها ال due date أو ال return date. طيب, do permanent and borrowed as entities require to have a primary key? No. Why is it not the case? عشان دول في الآخر sub classes the art object. يعني إيه؟ يعني كل واحد فيهم هنعمل كوب كده عشان نريكول إن ال art object دي هي super class ودول sub classes. طيب, why don't permanent and borrowed have to have a separate primary key? Because at the end of the day they inherit the attributes of the art objects which have the ID as one of its primary keys. So they inherit ال ID ده, فهم عندهم already a primary key ليهم. طيب, عندنا painting و sculpture. طيب, ال painting ده جواه ايه؟ material و type. material and type. وعنده style. طب و sculpture عندها ايه؟ عندها height و weight و material. height, weight and material. طيب, زي ما احنا قلنا ان we need the painting and the sculpture to inherit the attributes of permanent or borrowed plus the attributes of the art object. So they have to be subclasses to two different superclasses. يعني عندنا هنا multiple inheritance. عندنا هنا lattice. Okay? So this is the idea of the art object. عندنا also artist, which is another entity. The artist كان عنده name, date of birth, date of death, and main style. In general, there is no rule to put the primary key of the artist. However, I will say that the names that are famous of every artist are the ones that uniquely identify them. So we will store in our database a unique name for each artist for it to be uniquely identified. وعندنا collection اللي بنقدر نبارو منها art objects. collection دي كان جواها name و type, name و type and phone number. والprimary key in this case برضو ممكن نعتبره name ان الcollections ممكن يكون عندها a unique name that is stored in our database. وعندنا exhibition الاتريبيوتس بتاعتها عبارة عن name and theme, start date and end date. طيب, the primary key in this case also is negotiable. However, we would say that the name and the theme together are not repeated. يعني مع بعض uniquely identify each exhibition. مش هيبقى عندي two exhibitions with the same name and the same style. Okay. طيب, let us بقى start drawing the relationships. عندنا what types of relationships؟ عندنا ما بين ال artist and the art object. عشان ال artist creates the art object. عندنا ما بين الكولكشن والborrowed art objects ان الكولكشن دي provide this borrowed art object. وعندنا الاكزيبيشن in which different art objects are presented. So we present the different art objects in different exhibitions. So now let's start doing the cardinality and the participation. So the art object is created by how many artists? It's in general one and only one. So every art object has exactly one artist. If we allow for art objects to not have any artist, يعني لو artist information دي ضاعت ممكن نخليها هنا zero. We can do that and we can leave it as one. It depends on how you understand or how you are going to store your art objects in your database. It can be one and only one, it can be zero. طب الارتست ممكن يكريت how many art objects? In general many. الارتست الواحد ممكن يكريت many art objects. طب at minimum هل am I allowing artists to be stored in my database that have zero art objects designed for them? Yes, in general yes. ممكن يكون artist لسه ما عندوش ولا art object, so it will have zero art objects. طيب الكولكشن one collection provide لينا how many borrowed art objects? In general many. Can give us many art objects and at minimum zero. يعني I can have a collection that did not provide me any borrowed art objects. طب borrowed art object is provided by how many collections? One and only one, because every borrowed art object belongs to exactly one collection, so it's always one and only one. Okay. طيب art object الواحدة تبقى presented in how many exhibitions? In general many. There are many exhibitions that present this art object. طب at minimum الart object الواحدة ممكن تبقى presented in 0 exhibitions. اوكي. طب الاكزيبيشن الواحدة بيبقى فيها كام art object? In general many art objects. If I have one exhibition I can have more than one art object. طب at minimum there is at least one art object. يعني ما ينفعش اعمل exhibition where there are no art objects. At least I have one art object stored in it. طيب. Now this is in terms of the entities are complete with all its attributes along with the relationships. What is left is the completeness of the multiple inheritance along with الcircles اللي عندنا. نقول هما disjoint ولا overlapping وunion ولا لا. طيب أول حاجة عندنا هنا single inheritance. طيب هل عشان نقدر نشوف هي complete ولا لا، عشان نقدر نشوف احنا نحط two lines فوق هنا من الart object للcircles دي ولا لا، we need to ask ourselves هل all the art objects are either permanent or borrowed or both? Yes. هل في أي نوع تاني من الart objects؟ هل ينفع تكون art object that is not permanent and is not borrowed is something else? No. All the art objects are either permanent or borrowed. يبقى هنعمل ايه؟ هنحط هنا two lines. كده يبقى عندنا هنا two lines. طيب. The next question that I need to ask myself عشان عندي هنا single inheritance يبقى it's either disjoint or overlapping. يعني either ينفع تكون عندي حاجة permanent و borrowed at the same time أو هي يا إما permanent يا إما borrowed. In this case it's what? It's either permanent or borrowed. يبقى عندي الحاجات هنا ايه؟ disjoint. يبقى نحط هنا دي because they are disjoint. ما ينفعش يبقى عندي حاجة permanent و borrowed at the same time. طيب لما يكون عندي هنا بقى ايه؟ multiple inheritance. هل البينتينج كل البينتينجز اللي في الدنيا ممكن تبقى permanent و borrowed ولا ممكن يبقى فيه option تاني؟ يعني هل كل حاجة كل الأوبجكتس اللي عندنا هما painting و sculptures ولا do we have something else other than these؟ لا احنا in general we need to refer back to the question. طب لو احنا رحنا بصينا تاني على question هو بيقول لنا ايه؟ The art objects are also categorized into painting, sculpture and other. ده معناه ايه؟ ان there are other types. They are not restricted to painting و sculpture only. يبقى معناها هنا ان هما ايه؟ Not complete. السب classes بتاعتي are not complete. So I will leave it as one line. طيب هل هي union ولا left out؟ يعني هل احنا بنحط you ولا بنحطش حاجة؟ طيب let's see. هل البينتينج ينفع تبقى borrowed و permanent at the same time؟ ولا البينتينج هي يا اما borrowed يا اما permanent؟ لا هي يا اما permanent يا اما borrowed. والسكالبتشر نفس الحاجة هي يا اما permanent يا اما borrowed. يبقى it's what؟ It's it's union. يعني كل واحدة من sculptures أو paintings هتبقى يا إما permanent يا إما borrowed، وحد borrow الاتريبيوتس بتاعت art object كلهم على بعضهم. That's the whole EERD. Now it is complete with all the constraints that we can provide. Now to the next exercise. You need to build a small academic social network. The network has different users whose names, emails, addresses should be recorded. يبقى عندنا user هنا is an entity with the attributes of this user is our name, email, and address. Users can send friendship requests to other users that can in turn accept or reject the request. يبقى sending a friendship request is what? It's a relationship. طب what type of relationship? هما users can send to other users. يبقى what is it? It's a self-recursive relationship. هي relation ما بين user و another user. So it's at the end of the day a recursive relation. Offered courses have pages. يبقى عندنا courses عندهم pages. Each offered course يعني course ده عبارة عن entity has a name and a code. يبقى at the end of the day every course has a name and a code. Once the user subscribes to a course, he or she could add posts to the page. يبقى adding the post to the page يعني عندنا course عنده name و code. وبعد كده once the user subscribes to a course, then to a course page, he or she could add posts. يعني ممكن add post. يعني post ده عبارة عن إيه؟ عبارة عن entity to the page. Post can in turn have comments by his or by this or other users. يعني it can have comments و post. يعني عندنا comment ده عبارة عن برضو entity. طب هل post و comment دول normal entities؟ لا، هما زي ما احنا شايفين هما بيدependوا on something else. I want to tell you something. If you see a dependence, this is a result of being weak. If you see that something is depending on another entity, then this is a sign that this is a result of being a weak entity. Hence, فاحنا خدنا بالنا ايه ان post ده بيدepend على كذا حاجة. بيدepend عن ان اليوزر يبقى موجود عشان يقدر add this post، ولازم يبقى فيه page. ما هو لو ما فيش page مش هيبقى فيه post. if think of Facebook, if you delete a page مش كل البوست هتبقى deleted with it. يبقى البوست ده بيدepend على ايه؟ على البيج كلها. طب والكومنتس بتدepend على ايه؟ على البوستس. يعني if you delete a post all its comments are going to be deleted. فكده معناه ان البوست are having an identifying relationship with post، وبوست عندها an identifying relationship with course. ففي الاخر الكومنت بيدepend على البوست والبوست بيدepend على الكورس page. فالديبندنس دي is not the reason of being weak but it's a consequence. So if you see this consequence يبقى it's أكيد a result of being weak. طيب let us start drawing كده this ER. Now the first thing that we had was إن إحنا عندنا a user. So we need to draw this user. So we need to draw the user as a standalone entity. So we have a user. الاتريبيوتس بتاعته عبارة عن email, name و address. email, name and address. اوكي، وعندنا course page او page يعني which is another entity. الاتريبيوتس بتاعتها code and name. وعندنا post which is an entity on its own. وقلنا ان هي weak عشان هي بتدepend على ايه؟ البيج. يبقى عندها identifying relationship. البيج has posts. وعندنا comment which is another entity which is also weak and it depends on the post. ليه مش بتدepend على البيج directly؟ عشان ممكن البيج تكمل تكون موجودة with the post being deleted. فلو انا عملت delete البوست لازم الكومنت بتاعه كمان يروح. A post has also several comments. طيب what are the primary keys؟ اليوزر مين البرايمري كي بتاعه؟ We can say that the email can be used as the primary key عشان هو unique for every and each user. طب والpage ممكن use the code as its primary key. اوكي؟ البوست ممكن نزود عليه for example post number وان دي تكون حاجه بتايدنتيفاي البوست انسايد ا بيج، يعني كل بوست جوه كل بيج يكون عنده يونيك نمبر. وممكن نعمل برضو نفس الحاجه للكومنت، يبقى عنده كومنت نمبر، ده برضو بارت من الكي. فالكومنت نمبر هيبقى يونيك under a certain post، والبوست هيبقى البوست نمبر هيكون يونيك under a certain page. يعني في الاخر ممكن يكون عندي two posts with number one however each and every one belongs to a different page. ممكن عندي two comments number one بس كل comment منهم بيبقى regarded او بيبقى belonging to another post. طيب what relationships do I have؟ عندي اول relationship اللي هي sending او adding friend request، هنا add، which I saw that this is a recursive relationship. طب اليوزر الواحد ممكن add how many users؟ in general they can add many. طب at minimum 0 users. طب the user who receives this addition، اليوزر اللي الناحية دي اللي receive the addition the addition of the friendship request بيجي من how many users؟ if one is being added بيبقى added by how many users؟ بيبقى added by one and only one user. اوكي. طيب قلنا ان في حاجه اسمها accept. طب هل accept دي نحطها عند اليوزر؟ هل does it make sense to have this attribute عند اليوزر؟ لا، it does not make sense. Why? Because this adding بيبقى عنده ال accept criterion دي بتديبند على الاد، على الادنج، على الريليشن شيب دي، يعني مش بتديبند على اليوزر. هو انا لو عندي ايميل والنيم بتاع حد معين وادرس وعندي accept true or false، هل does this give you any intuition what does this mean؟ لا، هو الانتويشن بيجي منين؟ ان الادنج بتاع الفريندشيب ده بتاع البني ادم ده، الاديشن بتاع الفريندشيب ريكوست بتاعه للممبر التاني كان use successful or not، كان accepted or not. So the accept is actually an attribute on the relation، حاجه بتديبند على الريليشن ذات نفسها. اوكي. طيب the user may subscribe to pages، يعني عندنا هنا subscribe to pages. طيب اليوزر بقى ممكن subscribe to how many pages؟ in general many، و at minimum 0. a user can subscribe to 0 pages. طب البيج ممكن subscribe ليها how many users؟ in general many، و at minimum also 0. اوكي. طيب البيج can have how many posts؟ in general many، at minimum 0. طب البوست الواحد بقى belong to how many pages؟ البوست الواحد اليونيك belong ل one and only one page. يعني if I take a specific post then it belongs to exactly one page. طيب the same thing goes for the comments. البوست can have many comments or 0 comments. The one comment belongs to exactly one post. هنا one and only one post. طيب عندنا other relationships. اليوزر مين اللي بيكتب البوست؟ مش يوزر، يعني يوزر هنا write a post، writes a post. اليوزر writes how many posts؟ in general many، at minimum 0. والبوست is written by how many users؟ exactly one user، يعني ما فيش post بيتكتب من more than one user. طب the same thing goes for the comment. هنا writes a comment. طيب اليوزر ممكن write in general many comments، at minimum 0 comments. الكومنت بيبقى written by exactly one user، يعني مفيش comment بيكتبوا اكتر، يعني اليونيك comment دايما بيتكتب من exactly one user. Hence this is the full ERD. As you can see here we had two weak entities that are inheriting the primary key of the stronger entity page، والكومنت بتديبند على الويك entity اللي هي post، وpost بتديبند بقى على stronger entity اللي هي page. So this is the final EERD. I hope that this was descriptive clear. Please do not hesitate to ask if you have any further question or anything was not clear enough for you. Thank you again for listening, and I wish you the best of luck.